In 1945, while Europe celebrated the end of the war, a new front opened in Palestine. Under British mandate since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the territory had become a contested space between two conflicting national projects. Zionism, strengthened by the arrival of Jewish refugees from Europe, pushed for the creation of a national homeland. At the same time, Arab-Palestinian nationalism demanded an end to colonial rule and rejected both British administration and the demographic changes promoted from abroad. The fall of the Third Reich did not resolve the issue. On the contrary, it accelerated the clash of interests. With thousands of Holocaust survivors seeking a place to start anew, Palestine took center stage on the international agenda. In this context, the United Kingdom struggled to maintain control amid growing internal tensions, while the United States and the Soviet Union began to intervene, marking the start of a dispute with global reach. This documentary examines how, long before the 1948 war, the conflict that forever transformed Palestine's fate was set in motion. The financial plan of Zionism from Nazi Germany. In March 1933, just weeks after Hitler's rise to power, four key figures of German Zionism met in Jerusalem. Arthur Hanke, Abraham Landsberg, David Werner Senator, and Felix Rosenbluth, who would later become Israel's Minister of Justice, addressed an urgent matter: the fate of German Jews. Although no official anti-Semitic laws had yet been enacted, job exclusion was already evident, especially in the provinces. Many Jewish professionals were being removed from their positions, sparking growing interest in emigration, and Palestine was beginning to be seen as a real option. However, there was a barrier. Currency restrictions imposed by the German government since 1931 prevented money from leaving the country unless it served the national interest. The problem was clear. Jews with sufficient means to meet British requirements, particularly the threshold of £1,000, would not emigrate if they could not take their capital. Yet it was precisely these financially capable emigrants who were of greatest interest to the Zionist project in Palestine. It was Rosenbluth who proposed an unexpected idea: open a channel of negotiation with German authorities. Though the proposal surprised his colleagues, not for its content but for its feasibility, a key question arose: what could Zionism offer in exchange for permission to transfer funds? His answer was direct: facilitate the legal departure of thousands of German Jews. The proposal was met with skepticism, but the urgency of the moment forced consideration of options that, in other times, would have been unthinkable. Traditional Jewish organizations, loyal to the German state, opposed promoting emigration, and the Zionists in Berlin, already targeted by the Nazis as enemies, could not negotiate openly. An intermediary with political and financial connections, but no visible ties to the Zionist movement, was needed. Thus the name Sam Cohen emerged, a businessman with an ambiguous reputation. To some, an unscrupulous opportunist, to others, a benefactor acting for a greater cause. His discreet profile made him the ideal figure. He avoided public exposure, did not participate in official bodies, and, to this day, no photograph of him survives. Born in Lodz in 1890 and educated in economics in Marburg, he developed a network of key contacts in Germany during the First World War. In those years, he also built a reputation as a benefactor. He was one of the few civilians authorized by German imperial authorities to purchase food to alleviate hunger among Jews in occupied Warsaw. His involvement was considered selfless and non-profit. Throughout the 1920s, Cohen was courted by various organizations linked to the Zionist project. In 1923, he made a decisive investment that enabled the acquisition of strategic lands between Haifa and the Jezreel Valley. Years later, he supported the launch of the Encyclopedia Judaica, an iconic work of Jewish culture, with a generous sum. However, he almost always operated in the shadows, avoiding the spotlight. He traveled constantly, resided in multiple European cities, and maintained his base in a luxurious castle in Luxembourg. His style was discreet but effective. It was in this context, in late March 1933, that Cohen traveled to Frankfurt to take action. He met separately with two senior officials still active from the days of the Empire and the Weimar Republic. One was Hans Hartenstein, responsible for foreign currency control. The other, Hans Schmidt-Roelke, oversaw Middle Eastern affairs in the Foreign Ministry. The proposal was straightforward: allow the controlled transfer of funds for Jews willing to emigrate to Palestine, provided it also stimulated German exports. The idea was beneficial to multiple interests. For the Nazis, it meant the orderly departure of thousands of Jews, accompanied by a partial loss of assets to the benefit of the German financial system. The average emigrant could retain only a fraction of their capital, equivalent to 15,000 Reichsmarks, about 70,000 euros today, while the rest was frozen or allocated to taxes. For the regime, it also dealt a blow to the international boycott promoted by Jewish organizations abroad. And for the Zionist movement, it was a legal and effective way to finance the arrival of qualified immigrants to Palestine. While Sam Cohen returned to Palestine with preliminary approval for his proposal, German officials recommended that the technical details be coordinated directly with Heinrich Wolf, the Reich's consul in Jerusalem. Wolf represented German interests in a region the Nazis considered the epicenter of the global Jewish movement. Cohen set off immediately. In Berlin, however, contact between Cohen and the German Zionist Federation broke off amid the tense atmosphere prior to the boycott of April 1st. Georg Landauer, the organization's director and one of the few aware of the operation, was unable to communicate with Cohen before his departure. Nevertheless, he sent a letter to Cohen's hotel in Tel Aviv, acknowledging the progress made, though emphasizing that the legal situation regarding transfers remained complex. To protect identities and prevent leaks, communications during those days were signed with pseudonyms, omitted dates, or were destroyed after being read. Already in Jerusalem, Cohen handed over control of the matter to local representatives of German Zionism. To verify the information, they contacted Chaim Alosarov, a prominent figure in the Jewish agency. On March 30th, Alosarov sent a cable to London inquiring whether there was indeed a special foreign currency exemption for those emigrating to Palestine. Shortly thereafter, at a Jewish agency meeting, he discreetly suggested that it might be time to consider formal negotiations with the German authorities. He did not mention Cohen or the details of the agreement, but received approval to travel to Berlin. Concurrently, an indirect inquiry was made from London through the British Embassy in Berlin. The investigation involved several Reich agencies, as in addition to restrictions on withdrawing foreign currency, there was also a system of allocation only for operations deemed essential to the German economy. However, the law did not prohibit emigration, and every citizen could request foreign currency for that purpose, though typically only small amounts were approved. On April 5th, the British Embassy confirmed that Jews wishing to settle in Palestine and demonstrating possession of £1,000 were authorised to transfer that amount. From London, this was interpreted as a technical exception, without realising it was the result of a clandestine negotiation. Upon hearing the news, Professor Brodetsky, spokesperson for the British Jewish community, officially thanked the authorities, making it seem as though the credit was his. Meanwhile, Landauer, aware that £1,000 was insufficient to ensure self-sufficiency in Palestine, insisted on expanding the agreement. It was not just about saving people, but also about transferring the capital necessary to establish a new nation. From then on, the Zionist strategy began to reformulate. The initial goal, facilitating the departure of emigrants and securing them minimal resources, gave way to a more ambitious vision, leveraging the flow of blocked foreign currency to build a national economic infrastructure in Palestine without destabilizing the Nazi regime, which, paradoxically, needed to remain solvent for the mechanism to function. David Werner Senator, another key figure within the Jewish agency, made this clear in a confidential memorandum presented to the Zionist Executive Committee in London on July 24, 1933. At that time, the British capital served as one of the main centres of deliberation for international Zionism, where movement leaders gathered to coordinate strategies in response to the growing crisis in Germany. Even before the final agreement was signed, Senator proposed the creation of a large-scale financial entity. The idea was not merely an office to safeguard funds, but an institution capable of managing major economic operations. However, for political reasons, it was decided not to publicly use the term bank. The concept was that this entity would issue development bonds, securities sold abroad to raise funds, backed by the capital that German Jews could not directly withdraw from the country. These bonds would directly finance the economy of the Jewish community established in Palestine under the British Mandate, known as the Yishuv. Although a formal state did not yet exist, this network of local institutions already operated with a high degree of autonomy. It had schools, agricultural cooperatives, and its own administrative bodies. The goal was clear: to build the material and social infrastructure for a future Jewish state. Thus, it was not merely an economic operation, but a strategic tool to consolidate that national project. However, for the system to work, the German framework had to maintain its value. If the currency depreciated due to the international boycott or an internal crisis, the money available to emigrants would shrink and the bonds would lose strength. Senator proposed that the Reich government itself guarantee a stable conversion rate for the mark, that is, ensure its exchange value, and even commit to paying additional interest if the German economy weakened. In figures, the expectations were ambitious. Senator estimated that bonds backed by these immobilized funds could generate up to $150 million in just 2 years. He proposed a simple model: pay an annual interest of 7% and repay the invested money starting from the 6th year, in installments spread over 20 years. In return, the Zionists were willing to facilitate German exports to Palestine and other Near Eastern markets, allowing the Reich to sustain its foreign trade amid the crisis. Senator even suggested that the Jewish bank could offer loans to the German state to stimulate domestic employment or acquire shares in key sectors such as railways. In his analysis, any improvement in the general economy would also benefit the Jews still in Germany, whose survival depended on access to work and stability. But while these complex financial operations were being discussed, very different reports were arriving from Geneva. Leo Motzkin, leader of the Committee of Jewish Delegations, warned, as previously noted, that the Jewish community in Germany was living in an environment of systematic violence. Professionals and merchants across the country agreed in their diagnosis. They were trapped in a hell, the true dimensions of which were only beginning to be understood. Motzkin classified German Jews into 5 groups. On one hand, the convinced Zionists, who left quickly without concern for those left behind. They were joined by non-Zionists who, faced with the emergency, began considering emigration to Palestine. A third group, openly anti-Zionist, would only agree to leave if they could preserve their German language and customs. The fourth sector, tied to traditional institutions, blamed Eastern Jews and rejected any idea of emigrating. Finally, there were the German Jewish nationalists, deeply assimilated, who felt more German than Jewish. However, the report highlighted an unexpected transformation. Among the youth, even those from the most integrated sectors, a new identification with Jewish nationalism was growing. What decades of Zionist activism had not achieved, Hitler had provoked in weeks. Motzkin urged focusing efforts on rescuing this youth, open to starting a new life in Palestine. For adults, he proposed that only a sustained international economic boycott could pressure the regime to curb the violence. But this strategy faced a practical obstacle. Although the Third Reich wanted to expel the Jewish population, it was not willing to let their assets leave without gaining something in return. In London and Jerusalem, it became clear that Zionist action needed to focus once again on rescuing capital, not just lives. What was initially conceived as a humanitarian operation gave rise to a complex network of businesses. As the transfer system solidified, initiatives emerged to take advantage of its benefits to import machinery, industrial products, and consumer goods. In London, a publishing house was established, funded with blocked assets. In Jerusalem, Zionist figures like Rosenbluth and Landsberg created a company to import steel from Germany. And in August, an agreement was even reached to transfer brewing equipment to establish a new factory in Palestine. The financial model was clear. Part of the payment was made in foreign currency, and the rest in blocked currency within the Reich, ensuring profits. However, the line between collective good and private profitability began to blur. Capital took center stage, displacing the migrant as the focus of the effort. To prevent new cases like that of Sam Cohen, accused of prioritizing personal interests over the common goal, the Zionist leadership decided to intervene, incorporating institutional actors like Yakin, an agricultural company linked to the Histadrut, the dominant trade union federation in the organized Jewish community in Palestine. The expansion of the transfer mechanism brought internal disputes within the Zionist movement. As the volume of capital grew, so did tensions among the involved parties. At a meeting on July 31, 1933, the Histadrut, the central union linked to the Mapai Labour Party, revealed its true intentions. Its goal was not merely to participate in the agreement, but to displace Hanataya, one of the first entities involved, and take control of operations through its own company. The plan was ambitious. New German emigrants would be required to provide a forced loan to NIR, a subsidiary of Yakin. With those funds blocked in Germany, NIR would import products for the Yishuv's economy. But instead of fully depositing the revenue generated in Palestine, NIR would retain 2/3 of the value as a 15-year credit. That money would be channeled into agricultural projects, housing and land purchases. Although some questioned this formula, arguing it created inequality compared to Jews emigrating from other countries, the Histadrut leadership defended the model as necessary to prevent the system from falling into private hands. Landauer from Berlin shared this strategic vision. In a letter sent on August 17, 1933, to the German official Hans Hartenstein, he requested guarantees that the transferred funds be invested exclusively in Palestine. He even proposed conditioning emigration on meeting certain requirements, purchasing land, joining productive projects, or contributing to the collective investment fund. The concern was clear: to prevent the system from being used merely as a bridge to reach more attractive destinations, such as France or Holland. The logic behind these restrictions was evident. Without money, a refugee could only aspire to destitution. Amid increasingly restrictive migration policies in countries like the United States, capital had become as crucial as a passport. For the Zionist leadership, ensuring that funds remained in Palestine was not just a measure of economic control, but a filter to shape the future of an entire community. Chaim Weizmann, president of the Jewish Agency, reinforced this stance in a speech delivered in Paris at the end of May. He stated bluntly that keeping refugees in Europe amounted to fueling a new wave of anti-Semitism. His message was direct. The only viable response was not temporary asylum, but the construction of a permanent home in Eretz Israel. Even when alternative proposals emerged, such as Australia's offer to relocate thousands of families to its northern region, or the Jewish colonies in Crimea and Manchuria promoted by Japan, the Zionist movement rejected them on principle. Dispersing Jews again in foreign territories would only postpone the tragedy. For them, the only real solution was Palestine, without delay and without parallel routes. From rejection to recognition, how Zionism gained international support. After the war, Palestine was no longer the same. The Yishuv, with over 500,000 inhabitants, a functioning economy, and robust institutional networks, was emerging as a proto-state in motion. It had cultivated lands, its own military structures, and a consolidated infrastructure. But the greatest impetus for the Zionist project was not solely material. The catastrophe of the Holocaust transformed the aspiration for a Jewish state into an urgent demand, morally backed by the tragedy. Was made possible by the foundation built during the war years. Despite the uncertain context, the Yishuv managed to maintain a degree of stability. The role of the capital blocked in Germany, already explained earlier, was only part of the process. What made the difference was the Yishuv's ability to keep its internal structures active. Agricultural enterprises, cooperatives, housing projects and organizations like the Histadrut continued to operate despite the conflict. Many funds were lost with the disappearance of their owners in Europe, but others were gradually reintegrated into the local economy. These were not years of expansion, but of consolidation, and above all, of quiet preparation for what was to come. When the full extent of the Holocaust was revealed, the impact was immediate. For Western societies, the images from the camps, mass graves, emaciated bodies and industrial ovens, left little room for indifference. After such a tragedy, how could survivors be denied a place to rebuild their lives? Where could they be sent if neither Europe nor America opened their doors, and if countries like Poland still harbored residual violence? Simultaneously, the Shoah, the systematic extermination of European Jews, shook the foundations of assimilated Judaism. Many who had previously distrusted Zionism began to see it as a historical necessity. The genocide did not distinguish between Orthodox, secular, Eastern or Western European Jews. The shared experience strengthened a common identity, redefined priorities, and channeled even greater economic and political support toward Palestine, even from those who had no intention of emigrating. In contrast, Palestinian nationalism emerged weakened. The collaboration of figures like Mufti al-Husseini with the Nazi regime discredited it in the eyes of the West. Unable to offer renewed leadership, the Palestinian Arab movement was overshadowed by the governments of the Arab League, which assumed political representation of the territory. This turned Palestinians into secondary actors in their own destiny, subject to external decisions. From London, the new Labour government under Clement Attlee, theoretically supportive of Zionism, adopted a more pragmatic stance. Exhausted by the war, the United Kingdom opted to contain the conflict and maintain the status quo, relying on the 1939 White Paper, which restricted Jewish immigration and sought to avoid further tensions with the Arab population. But this time the British no longer decided alone. Washington, now a superpower, demanded a role. President Truman, influenced by pressure from the American Jewish community and the impact of the Holocaust, fully embraced the Zionist cause. In September 1945, he requested the immediate entry of 100,000 refugees into Palestine. Although London refused, the proposal triggered the creation of an Anglo-American commission tasked with studying the issue. Its report, presented in May 1946, acknowledged the desire of displaced persons to settle in Palestine and called for an end to immigration restrictions. But while diplomatic negotiations stalled, frustration grew on the ground. The main Zionist militias, the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi, launched a coordinated offensive against British targets. Together, they represented different shades of Jewish nationalism but agreed on one point: the time for waiting was over. The Zionist project, hardened by suffering, had decided to take action. The tension in Palestine continued to escalate after the British refusal to implement the Anglo-American Commission's recommendations. In response, Zionist armed groups intensified their actions. On a single night in June 1946, Palmach Commandos, the elite force of the Zionist movement, destroyed nearly all the bridges connecting the territory to neighboring countries. The next day, the Irgun kidnapped 6 British officers to prevent the execution of 2 of its militants. The mandate's response was immediate. On June 29th, British authorities launched Operation Agatha, known in the Yishuv as Black Saturday. Consequently, thousands were detained. Offices of the Jewish Agency and the Histadrut were raided. Among those arrested were political leaders, military cadres, and prominent Zionist figures. For many, it was a show of force aimed at dismantling the links between institutional structures and armed actions. The Haganah publicly denounced the operation as an act of total hostility against the Jewish people. Shortly afterward, the Irgun bombed the southern wing of the King David Hotel, the headquarters of British power in Jerusalem. The explosion caused over 90 deaths and marked a breaking point. From that moment, the Haganah distanced itself from terrorist strategies and focused its efforts on organizing clandestine immigration. The Irgun and Lehi, however, continued their urban offensive, even executing 2 British soldiers in retaliation for the deaths of 3 of their members. Zionist authorities publicly repudiated these acts, aware of the damage they could cause on the diplomatic front. Nevertheless, the cumulative effect of these armed actions was significant. 1945 and 1948, the mandate suffered over 300 casualties. The pressure, combined with political and economic exhaustion, reinforced London's conviction that it was time to withdraw. Meanwhile, thousands of Jewish refugees, many of them Holocaust survivors, attempted to reach Palestine through illegal routes, defying the restrictions imposed by the mandate. This immigration, known as Aliyah, became a central tool for mobilization and propaganda for the Zionist movement. Ships departed from Europe on increasingly risky routes. The goal was not only to reach their destination, but also to denounce the British blockade and highlight the tragedy. In 1947, the case of the Exodus showed the world the harshness of the conflict. Jews expelled from Nazi camps were now being turned away on the shores of Palestine. For Zionism, the symbolic impact was immense. That coordinated effort, on land, at sea, and in the diplomatic sphere, began to shift the international balance. But to understand how this turning point was reached, it is worth briefly stepping back to mid-1946. That summer, the United States reluctantly accepted a British proposal to create a technical committee to study the practical implementation of the Anglo-American report. The result was the Morrison-Grady Plan presented in July. The plan proposed dividing Palestine into 3 zones: an Arab province, a Jewish province, and a central strip under British control. Both provinces would have limited autonomy, while the territory as a whole would remain under the mandate. Although the plan allowed for the immediate entry of 100,000 refugees, the Truman administration rejected it. Arab governments also deemed it unacceptable. Only London showed genuine interest, seeing it as a way to maintain a strategic presence in the region. In August, meeting in Paris for security reasons, the Jewish Agency's executive officially rejected the proposal. However, under Ben-Gurion's leadership, a shift in approach began to take shape. The idea of controlling all of Palestine was abandoned, and a realistic territorial partition was tacitly accepted. Unlike the Arab bloc, which remained inflexible, the Zionist leadership started adapting to the political realities of the moment. Despite the intransigence of both sides on the ground, London organized a new conference in September. However, neither the Jewish Agency nor the Arab Higher Committee agreed to participate. The meeting, limited to delegates from Arab countries, ended without progress. Meanwhile, Zionist pragmatism began to bear fruit. In October, President Truman hinted for the first time at US support for a partition-based solution, a gesture of immense symbolic and political significance. With this backing, Ben-Gurion and other activist leaders gained strength within the movement. In December, the Zionist Congress in Basel cemented his leadership and committed to negotiating only on one basis: the creation of a sovereign Jewish state. The Morrison-Grady Plan was abandoned. Any new initiative would now have to pass through the filter of mainstream Zionism. In early 1947, the British attempted one final round of talks. The new plan, called Bevin, proposed semi-autonomous cantons and a 5-year transition period. Lacking solid support, the proposal quickly failed. Faced with the stalled negotiations, on February 18th of the same year, the British government announced in Westminster its decision to transfer the Palestine question to the United Nations. Shortly thereafter, the General Assembly called a special session on April 28th to define the scope and composition of an international commission tasked with studying the situation and proposing solutions. Although Arab states demanded an immediate resolution in favor of Palestinian independence, they did not secure the necessary support. The commission created, UNSCOP, its acronym in English, was a special UN body formed in May 1947 to study the situation in Palestine and propose possible solutions. It was composed of 11 countries not aligned with the major powers, among them Australia, Sweden, Czechoslovakia, India, Iran, Uruguay, and Guatemala. Its mandate was broad: to gather facts, analyze all dimensions of the problem, and deliver a report before September 1st. The majority of member states supported its creation. Only 7, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Afghanistan, voted against it. In this context, the great surprise came from the Soviet bloc. On May 14th, Andrei Gromyko, the Kremlin's representative, delivered an unexpected speech. He stated that after the horrors suffered during Nazism, it was understandable that Jews sought to create their own state. Although his initial stance favored a binational model, he acknowledged that if that formula was not viable, 2 independent states should be considered. This was a drastic shift from the Soviet Union's traditional line, which had historically been critical of Zionism. This shift was not driven by ideological sympathy. For decades, Zionism had been portrayed in Soviet rhetoric as a bourgeois and counter-revolutionary movement allied with British imperialism. However, the post-war geopolitical reality altered that calculation. The conservative Arab monarchies tied to London offered little room for expanding Soviet influence in the region. In contrast, the Yishuv, with its collectivist structures, Russian origin leadership, and clear confrontation with the United Kingdom, seemed a more receptive space. For Stalin, supporting partition and facilitating the creation of a Jewish state offered multiple strategic benefits, weakening the British presence in the Middle East, fueling tensions with the United States, and potentially opening a door for Soviet penetration in a geopolitically sensitive region. Zionism, at least at that moment, became a useful ally for the Kremlin's objectives. Following the Soviet intervention in favor of recognizing the Jewish people, Yun Skop's work progressed rapidly. In mid-June 1947, the Commission traveled to Palestine to begin its on-the-ground visits. The opposing stances between the two communities quickly became evident. The Arab-Palestinian leadership, led by the Arab Higher Committee, declared a total boycott of the Commission. They denied all legitimacy to the process and greeted the delegates with general strikes, explicit rejection, and a tense atmosphere marked even by episodes of anti-Semitism. This refusal had immediate effects. Delegates like Guatemala's Garcia Granados interpreted the Arab leadership's attitude as proof of intransigence. The lack of willingness to engage in dialogue strengthened the perception in favor of a negotiated partition. In contrast, the Yishuv adopted an opposite strategy: hospitality, cooperation, and active presentation of its proposals. From the Jewish Agency to communist and pacifist organizations, most sectors of the Zionist movement presented their arguments to the Commission members. Ben-Gurion, accompanied by figures such as Sharet and Kaplan, emphasized before the committee that the Jews still lacked their own state, while Arab countries already controlled vast areas of the regional map. Alongside him, representatives of religious Zionism, Jewish communism, and even sectors linked to the armed underground also made their voices heard. The Ionescopi's visits to agricultural settlements, testimonies about British repression, and the symbolic impact of the Exodus case decisively influenced the delegates' perceptions. Without official participation from Palestinian leaders, the committee tried to compensate by conducting interviews with Arab governments in Lebanon and Transjordan. Even so, the response was categorical: rejection of the Balfour Declaration, total opposition to Jewish immigration, and denial of rights to those who had arrived after 1917. The proposal for a compromise was deemed impossible by some members due to the rigidity shown. By the end of July, the committee returned to Europe. From Geneva, a delegation traveled to displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. The testimonies collected reflected the overwhelming desire of thousands of Jews to emigrate to Palestine, given the lack of real alternatives. By the end of August, UNSCOP concluded its deliberations and unanimously agreed that the British mandate must end. The majority proposed the creation of two states, with Jerusalem under an international regime. November 29, 1947, a resolution that changed everything. The partition proposal, arising from the UNSCOP report, returned to New York in September of 1947. Although it outlined two states, their borders were irregular and fragmented. The territory assigned to the future Jewish state included numerous Arab populations and discontinuous areas, while the city of Jerusalem was proposed as an international enclave. Despite its imperfections, the Jewish Agency accepted the partition as a necessary compromise. Only the most radical Zionist sectors, such as the Irgun and Lehi, openly rejected it. On the Arab side, reactions were unanimously negative. Both the partition plan and the federal proposal were deemed unacceptable. The Arab Higher Committee and regional governments denounced any attempt to divide Palestine as illegitimate. Simultaneously, they prepared for a potential armed confrontation. Faced with this scenario, the United Kingdom announced its decision not to support any solution lacking the consent of both parties. Its intention was to withdraw from the territory on May 15, 1948. The United Nations, through a new special committee, reopened the case. Arab states attempted to delay the process with proposals such as referring the issue to the Hague Tribunal, but they also resorted to threats of diplomatic reprisals against those supporting the partition. Meanwhile, Golda Meir and King Abdullah of Transjordan held secret meetings regarding a possible division of the Arab area, outside the official plan. On the international stage, the great powers adopted different positions. In the United States, President Truman openly supported the partition but faced caution from the State Department, which feared destabilizing the region. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, maintained its stance. It defended the Jewish people's right to sovereignty and offered full support to the project. In the weeks leading up to the vote, Moscow actively collaborated with the Jewish Agency. On November 29th, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 181. The text recommended the division of the territory into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. The resolution was approved with 33 votes in favor, 13 against, and 10 abstentions. But while the historic vote of November 29th was announced in New York, the atmosphere in Palestine was very different. In Jewish cities, thousands gathered around radios and loudspeakers to follow the voting process live. Each vote in favor of the partition was met with cheers, each rejection with boos. When the final result was announced, the streets erupted in celebrations. But for some, like Ben-Gurion, that euphoria was not a cause for relief, but a harbinger of an imminent confrontation. On the other side, in Arab communities, the news was received with anger and desolation. The Husseini press openly called for erasing with blood what the United Nations had approved on paper. Resolution 181, far from guaranteeing the effective creation of the Jewish state, placed the region on the brink of the abyss. Without an international force capable of implementing the plan, without British willingness to intervene, and with the opposition of Arab countries, the immediate future of Palestine was defined by uncertainty and violence. The following day, the first armed clashes began. 7 Jews died in an attack which triggered reprisals. Within weeks, the violence escalated into an undeclared civil war. Without state armies in direct combat and with the British passively withdrawing, 2 opposing communities within the same territory began a struggle for control of the future. In January of 1948, the conflict regionalized. Volunteers from Syria and Iraq joined the ranks of the self-proclaimed Arab Liberation Army, led by Fawzi al-Kawuchi under the umbrella of the Arab League. At the same time, violent attacks against Jewish communities in several Middle Eastern cities broke centuries of unequal coexistence. During the first weeks, most actions originated from the Arab side. Local militias, groups loyal to the Mufti, and regional fighters operated with geographic and numerical advantages, blocking key routes and isolating Jewish settlements. This tactic, known as the Battle of the Roads, caused numerous casualties among the Jewish forces of the Haganah and the Palmach, which were still operating defensively. Meanwhile, London avoided facilitating the transition. It denied entry to the UN-designated committee tasked with managing the handover and, in parallel, discreetly explored an alternative, transferring the Arab territory of Palestine to King Abdullah of Transjordan, its most loyal ally in the region. The initial phase of the conflict was not fought only in fields and roads. Jerusalem, with over 100,000 Jewish inhabitants, was virtually isolated by guerrilla operations led by Abdelkader al-Husseini. In 1948, the city began to suffer shortages of food and water due to the blockade imposed on the routes connecting it to Tel Aviv. Other enclaves, such as Gush Etzion, the Negev, or northern Galilee, were also left vulnerable, though Ben-Gurion explicitly prohibited their evacuation. Both sides resorted to urban terror and reprisals against civilians, but neither managed to shift the military balance. By the end of March, the situation of the Yishuv was critical. British media circulated the belief that, in the long term, the Jews would be defeated or forced into a compromise. Within the Haganah itself, doubts began to emerge. This stage would be remembered as the lowest point of the Zionist project. Also impacted the international stage. In Washington, the State Department, pressured by oil interests and alarmed by the possibility of Soviet influence, proposed suspending the partition and establishing an international administration under UN mandate. Delegate Warren Austin publicly announced this on March 19th before the Security Council. Truman, in the midst of an election campaign, did not contradict his diplomats. The firmest response came from Moscow. On March 23rd, Andrei Gromyko reiterated that the only way to halt the conflict was to implement the November 29th resolution without delay. Meanwhile, the Soviet delegation worked closely with the Jewish Agency to prevent any rollback at the UN. The United Kingdom, for its part, also rejected international oversight, fearing it would force them to remain in Palestine without controlling events. Among Arab countries, the American proposal was ignored. Most of them only considered the military option. King Abdullah, however, proposed a new formula of cantonization within an expanded kingdom, though it found no support. In the Zionist camp, the proposal was immediately rejected. Both moderate and radical leaders perceived it as a betrayal of their cause. Faced with the complex situation, the issue of leadership stuck to its roadmap. The creation of a transitional government, led by figures like Ben-Gurion and Sharet, ensured unified command and institutional preparation for the day the British mandate ended. Following tactical advances in previous weeks, the Yishuv sought to consolidate its advantage. The Hebrew community not only had a robust institutional organization, but also a rapidly evolving military structure. The Haganah, which in previous months had operated as a defensive militia, was transforming into a national army. Its reorganization involved the mandatory recruitment of tens of thousands of men and women, though initially only a fraction had functional weaponry. The most prepared corps was the Palmach, joined by fighters from the Irgun and Lehi, as well as thousands of international volunteers, many of them World War II veterans, known as Mahal. At the same time, the Haganah launched Plan D, a military strategy combining offensive operations with the takeover of public services and local administration. This shift responded to the need to quickly establish the foundations of an operational state. However, the major obstacle remained the lack of heavy weaponry. The embargo imposed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the UN severely restricted legal access to supplies. In response, the Soviet Union provided an alternative route. With its approval, Czechoslovakia signed agreements to supply arms, ammunition, planes, and tanks, many originally produced for the German army. This aid was crucial in shifting the military balance. On the Palestinian side, structural deficiencies were evident. The lack of unified leadership, fragmentation of forces, and absence of a functional state apparatus severely limited their response capacity. Most of their forces consisted of local militias with little coordination and limited resources. The Arab Liberation Army, sent by the Arab League, also failed to assert itself, undermined by internal divisions and personal rivalries, particularly between its commander al-Kawuchi and the Mufti al-Husseini. The political leadership, meanwhile, remained in exile, unable to establish effective authority on the ground. This vacuum was exploited by neighboring Arab armies, which advanced their own interests rather than a common cause. The result was a Zionist offensive that, from April, prioritized territorial control before foreign intervention, marking the beginning of a decisive turning point in the conflict. The turn of the Zionist forces in the spring of 1948 coincided with a series of episodes that would shape the fate of hundreds of thousands of people. One of these was the massacre in the Arab village of Deir Yassin, which occurred on April 9th. There, units of the Irgun and Lehi, with the authorization of the Haganah, killed more than 100 civilians. Although initial reports spoke of 254 victims, later investigations placed the number between 100 and 110. The condemnation from the Yishuv did not prevent reprisals. 4 days later, a Hebrew medical convoy was ambushed near Mount Scopus, resulting in 77 deaths. A month later, the fall of the Kfar Etzion kibbutz ended with the execution of most of its defenders. Beyond the death toll, the psychological impact of Deir Yassin was profound. The news spread widely and sowed uncontainable fear. Even before these events, approximately 75,000 Palestinians, mostly from affluent classes, had left the country to avoid the ravages of the conflict. From then on, the exodus accelerated. There is no solid evidence that Arab authorities ordered these departures. The narrative of a so-called triumphal return lacks documentary support. Intermingled communities and rural areas where every inhabitant could be a combatant turned civilians into potential targets or risks. The Hebrew forces sought to take control of strategic locations, often displacing their inhabitants. The objective was twofold: to secure the territory and reduce the Arab demographic weight within the future state. Without adopting a systematic expulsion policy, certain operations and their brutality contributed to encouraging flight. In areas where attacks occurred, such as Tiberias or Haifa, attempts to persuade Arabs to stay were unsuccessful. By mid-May, the number of displaced persons had risen to 380,000. The disintegration of the Arab social fabric facilitated the Zionist advance. For neighboring capitals, the refugee crisis provided moral justification for imminent military intervention. King Abdullah himself considered return conditional on a military victory that had yet to be fought. 14th, 1948, an event that would change the history of the Middle East took place in Tel Aviv. In a modest room at the local museum, under an image of Theodor Herzl flanked by white and blue flags, about 350 people gathered. Leaders, mayors, intellectuals, religious representatives, and members of the People's Council not under siege in Jerusalem. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, David Ben-Gurion began reading the Declaration of Independence. In his speech, he evoked the Jewish people's historical ties to the land, the suffering of exile, the Holocaust, and the recent support of the United Nations. In the name of historical rights and international legitimacy, he proclaimed the birth of the State of Israel. The text emphasized a commitment to Jewish immigration, democratic values, and equal rights for all citizens. It also called for peace with the Arab population and requested the new state's admission to the international community. After the reading, the document was signed, mandate laws were repealed, and Hatikva, the Zionist movement's anthem, was played. In Tel Aviv, the population celebrated with hugs, tears, and songs, while fighting continued intensely on other fronts. Outside the Arab world, reactions were mostly favorable. President Truman recognized Israel de facto just 11 minutes after the British mandate expired. In Western Europe, progressive media welcomed the emergence of the new state, while enthusiastic messages from Soviet bloc countries highlighted both the Hebrew struggle and Moscow's support. De jure recognition by the Soviet Union was formalized on May 17th, even ahead of the United States. In contrast, Arab declarations were marked by threats and apocalyptic tones. From proclamations annulling rights to explicit calls for holy war, the reactions revealed the depth of rejection. Despite the defiant tone, the armies that crossed the borders in the following hours did so without a common strategy or defined objectives. Lacking preparation, coordination, and motivation, their contingents faced a reality far more complex than their leaders projected. Following the proclamation of the State of Israel, the conventional war began to shape the political map of Palestine. The Arab countries, though theoretically possessing a military potential of up to 165,000 troops, sent only a fraction of their forces into combat. Most regimes prioritized internal control and avoided committing the bulk of their forces. The initial contingent assembled in Palestine did not exceed 30,000 men, reinforced